He had always lived a quiet life. Neighbors would describe him as the kind of person who smiled when greeted, helped when needed, and stayed out of drama. He liked his routines, his mornings with coffee on the porch, watching the world wake up slowly. He wasn't someone who looked for trouble, and yet somehow, trouble found him. It began with small things. At first, it was hardly noticeable. A car parked too close to his driveway. A lawnmower left running late into the evening. Small noises that might annoy anyone, but that he usually ignored. He had learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting. Peace of mind, he believed, was worth more than pride or confrontation. Then the disturbances started to feel deliberate. A package left on his doorstep, not for him but clearly meant to block his way in or out. The mailbox, usually neat and orderly, was getting hit by stray balls or shoved around. It was obvious to him now. Someone was trying to provoke him. He tried to brush it off. Maybe it was children playing. Maybe it was a neighbor unaware of the trouble it caused. He told himself that overreacting would only make things worse. Still, the incidents grew bolder, and the quiet annoyance began to feel like something else entirely. A challenge. One morning, while stepping out to get the newspaper, he noticed tire marks across his small front lawn. Fresh marks, not from a careless driver, but from someone who had driven right onto the grass. His first instinct was anger, but he took a deep breath. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. He made a mental note to take pictures, document everything. It wasn't long before the first confrontation happened. He had been trimming his hedges, working quietly, when a group of people from the neighborhood strolled past. They laughed loudly at him, making jokes about his appearance and work. At first, he ignored them, focusing on the rhythm of the shears in his hands. "Hey, watch where you're trimming," one of them shouted sarcastically. "Don't hurt the grass too much, it might get scared." He looked up slowly, giving them a polite smile. He said nothing. It was a simple choice, one he hoped would diffuse the situation. But their laughter only grew louder. They began circling the yard, making comments, trying to catch his attention, testing his patience. He realized something in that moment. These people didn't just want to annoy him, they wanted to see how far they could push him. They assumed that because he was calm, because he didn't immediately respond with anger, he was weak, and they were wrong. He stopped trimming for a moment and leaned on his shears. He studied them carefully, noting each face, their gestures, the way they moved together like a group that thrived on intimidation. There was no malice in his mind toward them, no desire for revenge. But there was clarity, clear understanding that the next step would need precision. For the next few days, the pattern continued. Small acts of provocation, each designed to test boundaries. He noticed that the group would time their actions carefully, often when he was busy or distracted. At first, he felt frustration creeping in. But he reminded himself that frustration alone is a trap. Acting on emotion would only give them satisfaction. He began paying attention to their routines. When they walked by, what direction they came from, the times they were most active. Every small detail became part of a growing picture. It was almost like a puzzle. He was quietly collecting the pieces without their knowledge. At work, the same thing started to happen. He would see glances from colleagues, hear whispers as he walked by. Nothing direct, nothing that could be called harassment, but a subtle undermining. Papers would be misplaced, meetings scheduled without him in mind, casual remarks meant to make him feel excluded. People assumed he didn't notice. They were wrong. He realized that patience was his ally. The group, thinking they had power over him, didn't consider that his silence was not weakness, but observation. While they laughed, he was calculating. While they mocked, he was preparing. Every small act, every jab, was being stored in his mind. Analyzed, remembered. One evening, as he sat on his porch with the sky turning soft shades of pink and orange, he reflected on the past weeks. This wasn't just about the grass, the mailbox, or minor annoyances. This was about respect, about boundaries, about people assuming they could take liberties with someone who would simply smile and let them. He understood now that the quietest people often held the greatest strength. The next morning brought another challenge. He found his driveway blocked by a car, an unfamiliar license plate, clearly parked to annoy him. His first reaction was irritation, but he reminded himself of a rule he lived by: control the moment. Don't let the moment control you. He took out his phone, calmly noted the license plate, and called the local authorities to report the obstruction. Not angrily, not accusingly, but simply as a fact. He described the situation, gave all details clearly, and asked what steps could be taken to prevent future incidents. The officer on the line responded politely. Noting that someone would come to check and that he should continue documenting everything, the act of taking formal steps, rather than lashing out, felt satisfying in an unexpected way. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't satisfaction from seeing them scolded. It was simply reclaiming control. He realized that control was something no one could take from him unless he allowed it. Days passed, and the provocations continued. Each time he responded the same way: observation, documentation.com. He didn't engage in arguments. He didn't shout. He didn't give them the thrill of seeing him flustered. The group began to notice, of course. Their tactics seemed to have less effect. Where once they expected an immediate reaction, now there was only quiet, unshakable patience. And yet the group didn't stop. They thought they could wear him down, were his patience thin. They underestimated him. They assumed that quiet people would eventually break. That was their mistake. One afternoon, one of them stepped a little too close, leaning over the fence, making a crude joke aimed directly at him. Normally, this might have been the breaking point for someone else, but he stayed composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even make a sharp gesture. He simply looked at them, directly and calmly, letting his gaze hold steady. The effect was immediate. The person froze, unsure of how to proceed, feeling the weight of someone who didn't react out of fear, anger, or surprise. There was a tension in the air now that hadn't been there before. Slowly, the group backed off, retreating for the moment. Sensing that their usual tactics might not work here, it was a small victory, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. He understood that the coming days would require more than patience. He would need strategy, clarity, and above all, the courage to assert his authority when the time was right. For now, observation and calm would suffice. But the foundation for the eventual turn of events was already being laid by evening. He sat back in his chair, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet now. His mind, however, was far from quiet. He was already thinking through every scenario, imagining how he could respond in a way that would not just stop the harassment, but make it clear that boundaries were not to be crossed. It was a strange feeling, knowing that people underestimated him so completely. They saw a quiet man, someone who didn't fight immediately, and assumed that meant weakness. But real strength, he thought, is often invisible. It is silent. It waits. It observes, and then, at the right moment, it acts. That night, he slept with a calm mind. For the first time, the provocations felt less like a threat and more like a signal that he needed to prepare to stand firm, and to ensure that when he finally revealed his authority, there would be no doubt in anyone's mind about who was truly in control. By the end of part 1, the stage was set. The quiet man, underestimated and overlooked, had been pushed and prodded. But instead of reacting impulsively, he had chosen patience, clarity, and observation. Every small act of disrespect had been noted, every pattern recognized. And though no one knew it yet, the moment of reckoning was approaching, a moment where calm, careful preparation would shock everyone who had dared to mess with him. He had learned an important truth. Those who appear quiet and unassuming often hold the greatest power. And those who try to challenge them without understanding that power are in for a surprise they will never forget. The next morning, he woke up early, just as the first light touched the rooftops of the quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew on the grass. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in, and thought about the day ahead. The previous week had been a test of patience, and he knew the challenges were far from over as he stepped outside. He immediately noticed the subtle changes. The group of people who had been testing him before were already active, walking down the street with the same confident strides, laughing and nudging one another. Their faces carried a look of curiosity now, mixed with slight confusion. They were beginning to realize that their usual tricks didn't have the same effect, but they didn't know why he didn't react. He walked with a steady pace, keeping his eyes on the path ahead but careful to observe them from the corner of his eyes. He noted their body language, the way they tried to intimidate, and the way their laughter lacked the edge it had once carried. Something had shifted, though they hadn't recognized it yet. The first encounter of the day was small, almost trivial. One of them dropped a small trash bag near his driveway, making sure he would see it. A child might have seen it as a mistake, but he knew it was deliberate. He bent down slowly, picked up the bag, and tossed it into his own garbage bin. There was no anger, no sigh of frustration, only calm action. "What's the matter with him?" one of the group muttered, trying to sound casual. But his words carried uncertainty. They expected a reaction, a sharp tone, maybe even a shout. But all they got was a small, polite nod. It was a small thing, but it was effective. The calmness unnerved them more than anger could have. For the first time, they felt that their power over him wasn't guaranteed. He decided to walk the perimeter of his property that morning, not just to keep things tidy, but to make sure nothing else was out of place. As he walked, he noticed footprints in the soil near the garden. They were fresh, too large to be from a child. Someone had walked right through the flower beds, probably to leave a mark or to provoke. Instead of reacting with anger, he took out his phone and took pictures, documenting everything carefully. Every step, every small disturbance was being recorded. He knew that patience alone wasn't enough. He needed proof, and he needed a plan. By mid-morning, the group had gathered near the street corner, clearly observing him. He noticed them laughing quietly, whispering, trying to plan their next move. But he also noticed the subtle tension in their gestures, the way they glanced at each other, the way one of them frowned. Unsure if what they were doing was having the intended effect, he remembered the previous evening. Sitting on his porch, thinking about control. This was exactly the moment he had anticipated. The group assumed they had the upper hand, but they had no idea how much he had already prepared. He knew that, to maintain authority, he couldn't act impulsively. He had to wait for the right moment, and when it came, it would be clear. Undeniable around noon, he decided to run an errand in town. He walked past the group casually, carrying his bag, and they noticed him immediately. One of them called out, trying to get his attention. "Hey, don't forget to smile for us." He turned his head slightly, offering a polite smile without stopping, without breaking stride. That small gesture, calm and controlled, seemed to annoy them more than anger ever could. Their confidence was cracking, just a little, though they wouldn't admit it. At the store, he overheard them speaking quietly, likely speculating about his actions. It was clear they were puzzled. They had spent days trying to provoke him, and yet he remained calm, measured, and seemingly unbothered. That realization, however small, was starting to change their attitude. Returning home, he found another small act of defiance. A note had been slipped under his door, containing rude words and implied threats. He read it slowly, then set it aside without a word. The group wanted to see an emotional reaction, some sign of fear or irritation. Instead, he simply documented the note and moved on. He decided it was time to take another quiet, strategic step. He began talking to neighbors who were witnesses to the provocations, explaining calmly what had been happening without accusing anyone directly. He asked for advice on handling the situation, and in doing so, subtly made it clear that he was aware, prepared, and thoughtful. Some neighbors, who had been silent before, nodded quietly, offering small words of encouragement. Others looked at him with respect, realizing that this man was not someone to be underestimated. The group that had been causing trouble began to notice the subtle changes in the neighborhood atmosphere. People were no longer laughing at the situation. They were quietly observing, watching for the next move. By evening, the tension had grown significantly. The group seemed unsure, hesitant to act as boldly as they had before. The once loud, confident laughter was now quieter, and their glances toward him carried a hint of caution. He didn't push them, didn't call attention to their unease. He simply carried himself with the same calm confidence, showing through his actions that he was in control. He spent the evening preparing for the coming days. He reviewed the documentation he had collected, photos, notes, observations, even the small conversations with neighbors. Every detail, no matter how minor, was part of the larger picture. He understood that the group was testing not just his patience, but his authority, and he intended to respond in a way that would make their assumptions completely wrong. That night, reflected on the events of the day, it was clear that the provocations were intensifying not because of weakness, but because they were frustrated. The group could feel that he was not as easy to manipulate as they had thought. Their confidence was cracking, and he could see it clearly in their behavior. He understood something important. Authority is not always about shouting or enforcing rules immediately. Sometimes, authority is quiet, measured, and deliberate. By staying calm, documenting everything, and involving witnesses subtly. He had already begun to shift the balance of power. The following morning brought another test. He found a small pile of debris near his walkway, likely placed by someone from the group. His first instinct was irritation, but he caught himself. He smiled faintly, picked up the debris, and carried it to the bin without a word. Every action was calm, deliberate, and controlled. That day, the group tried a different tactic. They spread rumors, hoping to make him look foolish in front of the neighbors. They whispered, hoping to create doubt and uncertainty. But he remained unaffected. He spoke with neighbors casually, maintaining a normal demeanor, showing no hint of frustration or concern. Slowly, those who had been listening began to see the truth. This man was not someone who could be manipulated or intimidated. The subtle shift in perception was undeniable. The group, once confident, now moved with caution. Their whispers grew quieter, their laughter less confident. They tried new tactics, but nothing seemed to shake his calm by the evening. He had reinforced his position without confrontation. He had shown through action, patience, and quiet authority that he was aware, prepared, and in control. The group, for the first time, realized that their usual methods were ineffective. They had underestimated him, and the consequences of that underestimation would only grow. He sat on his porch once more, sipping his tea, reflecting on the day. He thought about how people often judge others too quickly, assuming that quietness means weakness. He knew now that strength often hides in plain sight, and while the group had tested him repeatedly, they had only strengthened his understanding of authority, patience, and control. As night fell, he prepared for the coming days with a sense of quiet confidence. The challenges were far from over, but he knew he was ready. The small victories of calmness, observation, and preparation had already begun to shift the balance. The group had been bold, overconfident. Now they were beginning to feel the weight of their own misjudgment. By the end of part 2, it was clear that the quiet man was no longer just a passive target. He was becoming a presence that commanded attention, subtly but firmly. His calm authority had begun to unsettle the group, and the neighborhood itself was starting to notice. The story was building, and the eventual moment of revelation was growing closer with each passing day. He had learned an important lesson. True authority is not forced. It is demonstrated through consistent, controlled action, careful observation, and quiet confidence. And those who underestimate it often find themselves in a position they never expected, powerless, unsure and shocked when the moment finally comes. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. But beneath that calm, a storm was quietly gathering. The man had settled into a rhythm, observing the group that had been causing trouble. Their confidence was noticeably shaken. They laughed less, whispered more, and seemed uncertain in ways they hadn't before. Yet he knew that this was only the beginning. He had learned long ago that patience and preparation were far more powerful than anger or confrontation. Every morning, he walked around his property, checking for new signs of disturbance. Small things continued: footprints, trash, notes, but he handled each calmly with careful documentation. He never let himself show irritation. The group had been trying to provoke him for weeks, and now the effect was fading. Their usual tactics were no longer effective. He also started paying attention to the subtle ways. The neighbors responded to the situation. Some had begun to speak with him quietly, offering hints or advice, often without even realizing it. Others observed from a distance, curious about how he would handle the continued provocations. He realized that his calm demeanor was starting to command respect. People were noticing that he was aware, prepared, and not easily shaken. At work, he began to notice small shifts as well. Colleagues who had once tried to undermine him subtly were now hesitant. Meetings that had been tense were calmer when he was present. People listened more carefully, spoke more thoughtfully. He wasn't doing anything overt to assert authority yet, but his steady presence had begun to make an impact. His reputation as someone who was both competent and calm was spreading quietly but firmly. One afternoon, he discovered that the group had taken things a step further. A note had been left, warning him to stop making trouble or face consequences. The tone was clearly intended to intimidate, but he remained composed. He photographed the note and stored it carefully. Then he spoke to a neighbor who had witnessed the group leaving the note. He asked casually if they had seen anything unusual, and the neighbor confirmed the details. Without raising his voice, he gathered information that would prove invaluable later. He realized now that the group had underestimated him entirely. They assumed that quiet and patience meant weakness. They assumed that no immediate reaction was equivalent to submission. But in reality, his silence was a tool, a way to observe, collect evidence, and understand the patterns of their behavior. Every action, every misstep, was being recorded in his mind, ready to be used when the moment was right. As he continued his observations, he also began to understand the psychology of the group. They were used to being in control, used to getting reactions from others. When they saw that he was unaffected, that he responded only with calm and careful action, it unsettled them. He could see it in their faces, the small hesitations, the way they looked at each other for guidance. Their confidence was cracking, and that realization brought him a quiet sense of satisfaction, not from revenge, but from knowing that truth and preparation were stronger than noise and intimidation at home. He reviewed all the evidence he had collected. Notes, photos, witness accounts, even small observations about timing and behavior, all of it was organized carefully. He knew that when the time came to assert his authority, it had to be undeniable. There would be no room for dispute, no chance for the group to claim innocence. Everything was being prepared meticulously, with patience and precision. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, he thought about the coming confrontation. He knew it would not be a single dramatic moment of shouting or force. It would be a controlled, measured revelation, demonstrating that authority and respect are earned through knowledge, preparation, and calm action. He understood that those who had tried to provoke him would be shocked, not by anger, but by the realization that they had misjudged the situation completely. The next day brought a subtle but important development. The group tried to approach him in a public setting, hoping to create a scene. They whispered threats and sarcastic comments, expecting a reaction. But he remained calm, speaking politely to others around him, ignoring their attempts to provoke him. His demeanor was steady, unshakable, and deliberate. Neighbors began to notice the contrast. While the group tried to create tension, he remained composed. People were observing the behavior closely, noting the subtle shift in power. The group, once confident and bold, was now cautious and uncertain. Their whispers and laughter no longer carried the same authority. They were beginning to lose influence, not through force, but through the quiet strength of calm observation. He realized that authority is often most powerful when it is invisible. When people see that someone is calm, prepared, and aware, it creates an effect that is far stronger than any display of anger. His presence alone began to command respect. He didn't need to confront directly his actions, and his patience were already changing the dynamics. During the following week, the group tried a few more small provocations. A few items were left on his driveway, some minor vandalism occurred near the property, and more notes appeared under his door. Each time, he responded the same way, calmly, carefully, and without letting emotion dictate action. He documented everything, made phone calls when necessary, and spoke with witnesses. Every small act was building a larger picture. One afternoon, he decided to speak with the local authorities quietly, not in anger, not as a complaint, but to inform them of a pattern of behavior that had been occurring over weeks. He presented the evidence in a calm, factual manner. The officer he spoke with listened carefully, noted the details, and assured him that they would keep an eye on the situation. The man left the station feeling confident that he had strengthened his position not by confrontation, but by using the proper channels effectively at home. He continued to prepare. He reviewed every encounter, every act of provocation, and every interaction. He noticed small things he hadn't before. The way the group moved, the times they were most likely to act, and even the subtle changes in their language when they spoke. This attention to detail gave him a clear advantage. He was no longer reacting blindly. He was anticipating their actions, understanding their motives, and preparing for the moment when he would finally assert his authority. By evening, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The group had begun to whisper among themselves, uncertain about their next move. Their confidence was slipping, and it was noticeable not only to him but to the neighbors as well. People began to take his side quietly, offering support without making a scene. The man realized that his approach was working, calm. Careful observation and preparation had already shifted the balance of power. The group, sensing that their usual tactics were ineffective, began to escalate in subtle ways. They tried to provoke others, spread rumors, and create tension indirectly. But he remained unaffected. He engaged with neighbors politely, handled minor provocations calmly, and continued to document everything. Each action he took reinforced his quiet authority and demonstrated that he was not someone to be manipulated. One evening, as he reviewed the day's events, he realized that the coming moment of revelation was approaching. The group's confidence had been weakened. The neighborhood was aware, and his preparation was nearly complete. He knew exactly what he needed to do to assert his authority, and he was confident that the results would be unmistakable. He also reflected on what he had learned about human nature. People often assume that those who are quiet or patient are weak. They assume that those who do not react immediately are unaware or unprepared. But true strength often lies in silence, in observation, and in careful preparation. Those who underestimate such strength often find themselves in situations they never expected, powerless and unsure. The man spent the night planning the final steps carefully. He organized his evidence, reviewed his notes, and considered the timing of each action. He knew that when he finally acted, it would need to be clear, deliberate, and undeniable. The group had been bold, overconfident, and careless. They had assumed that their provocations would go unchallenged. Now, they were about to learn the consequences of misjudging someone who understood authority, preparation, and patience. By the end of Part 3, the tension had reached a critical point. The group was beginning to realize that their usual tactics no longer worked. Their confidence was eroding, and the neighborhood was quietly observing the shift in power. The man's calm, patient, and strategic approach had set the stage for the coming revelation. The moment when he would finally demonstrate his true authority was drawing near, and when it came, it would shock everyone who had dared to challenge him. He understood that authority is not about anger or shouting. It is about knowledge, preparation, and the quiet confidence to act at the right moment. By observing, documenting, and patiently waiting, he had already begun to change the dynamics completely. Those who underestimated him were now vulnerable, and the coming events would prove that calm, careful action is often more powerful than any display of force. The day had arrived, though the man treated it as any other. Calmness had become his armor, observation his tool, and preparation his ally. The provocations from the group had grown bolder in recent days, almost as if they sensed something had shifted. They were curious, cautious, but unaware that he had quietly built an unshakable foundation of authority. Beneath the surface, he began his morning with a routine walk around his property. Each corner, each walkway, each small space had been observed and secured. Nothing was left to chance. Small disruptions had been carefully documented. Conversations with neighbors quietly noted, and all evidence organized meticulously. This was not impulsive action. It was strategy, practiced over weeks of patience. The group was already active in the neighborhood when he stepped outside. They lingered near a street corner, glancing toward him with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. He could see the subtle hesitations, the whispered discussions, the silent questioning of their own actions. They thought they were in control, but they were beginning to realize something was different. He did not look at them with anger or challenge. He simply walked past, calm, deliberate, almost invisible, yet entirely aware. The first test of the day came quickly. One of the group approached his driveway, a small smirk on his face, dropping a note as though it were a challenge. The man bent slightly, picked it up carefully, and set it aside. He didn't read it aloud, didn't comment, and didn't react. Instead, he documented it, noting the handwriting, the placement, the timing. He knew that every detail mattered. By midday, the provocations grew more direct. The group attempted to confront him in a more public space, speaking loudly, trying to attract attention from neighbors and passers-by. Their words were intended to embarrass, intimidate, and provoke. But he remained calm, speaking politely to those around him, ignoring the jabs entirely. His demeanor was steady, controlled, and deliberate. Every step, every word, every glance showed that he was in full control. It was clear to the observers' neighbors, passers-by, and even the group themselves that something was different. The group's confidence was faltering. They expected a reaction, a sign of weakness, some acknowledgement that their provocations were effective. Instead, they saw a man whose quiet strength and calm presence commanded attention without a single raised voice. That afternoon, he decided it was time to involve the authorities once more, but this time with a purpose beyond reporting minor disturbances. He had collected weeks of evidence, and it was now ready to be presented in a way that would make his position undeniable. He contacted the local office and arranged for a formal meeting. Calmly explaining that he had a situation requiring attention, he did not exaggerate or dramatize. He simply stated the facts, confident that the evidence spoke for itself. When the authorities arrived, he walked them through everything carefully. Photos, notes, witness statements, and the timeline of events were all presented clearly and methodically. The officers listened closely, noting every detail. There was no anger, no dramatics, only clarity and calm authority. By the time the presentation was complete, it was undeniable that the provocations had been deliberate, organized, and ongoing. Returning home, he could already sense the tension building among the group. They had heard whispers that he had involved the authorities and were beginning to understand that their actions were no longer harmless pranks or subtle intimidation. The balance of power was shifting, though they had no clear understanding of how. They only knew that their confidence was slipping. As evening approached, he prepared for the final stage of revelation. The neighborhood had gathered quietly, curious about the tension that had been building over weeks. People had begun to notice the shift in dynamics. There was a growing sense that something significant was about to occur. The group, still unaware of the full extent of his authority, moved cautiously, trying to appear confident while secretly unsure. He stepped outside, walking slowly to the center of the gathering. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and calm. He addressed the group in a steady voice, clear and composed. "You have been testing boundaries," he said. "You have assumed that patience and silence mean weakness. You have been wrong." The effect was immediate. The group froze, unsure how to respond. Their eyes darted to one another, searching for guidance. Realizing for the first time that they had misjudged him completely, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the soft murmurs of neighbors who had been observing the scene. He continued, presenting the evidence calmly but firmly. Photos, notes, witness accounts, and the documented timeline of provocations were all laid out clearly. Each piece demonstrated the deliberate nature of the group's actions, and each piece underscored the man's patience, preparation, and control. The group tried to interrupt, to protest, but their voices lacked authority. The calm, measured clarity of his words and evidence left no room for argument. For the first time, the full weight of his authority became visible. He was not simply reacting to provocation. He had anticipated every action, collected every detail, and prepared a response that was undeniable. The group's confidence crumbled, replaced by shock, disbelief, and a sudden, comfortable awareness of their own mistakes. Neighbors watched, quietly impressed. They had observed the provocations, the calm patience, and now the clear, undeniable authority. It was evident that the man had not only defended his boundaries, but had done so with precision, strategy, and remarkable composure. The lesson was clear. Respect is earned, not demanded. And true authority is revealed not through anger, but through calm, deliberate action. One member of the group finally spoke, attempting to defend their actions. But the man's calm, unwavering gaze and the documented evidence silenced them instantly. It was clear to everyone present that there was no justification for their behavior. Their assumptions, their overconfidence, and their misjudgment had led them to a place of vulnerability they had never anticipated. The authorities, having reviewed the evidence and witnessed the interactions, acknowledged the man's claims. They confirmed that the provocations were deliberate and that appropriate steps would be taken to prevent future incidents. The group, now facing real consequences, understood the full extent of the miscalculation they had made. As the sun began to set, the man walked through the neighborhood with quiet confidence. He did not gloat, did not taunt, and did not raise his voice. The shift in power was clear through his calm presence alone. Neighbors nodded respectfully, some whispering words of admiration. The group, humbled and shocked, retreated quietly, understanding that their previous assumptions had been entirely wrong. By nightfall, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed completely. The man's calm authority had been revealed, respected, and acknowledged. The group's previous attempts at provocation were no longer effective. Their confidence had been replaced by caution and humility. The lesson was clear to all. Patience, preparation, and measured action are more powerful than loud words, impulsive reactions, or assumed dominance. He returned home. Reflecting on the day, the revelation had not required anger, shouting, or force. It had required patience, careful observation, and the deliberate use of authority. He understood that many people underestimate quiet strength, assuming that silence means weakness. Yet, as the day had proven, true authority often lies in calmness, preparation. In clarity, he prepared for the days ahead, knowing that the group had learned their lesson, but also aware that maintaining boundaries required continued vigilance. The power dynamic had shifted, and respect had been restored not through confrontation, but through strategy, evidence, and quiet authority. By the end of Part 4, the full weight of his authority had been revealed. The group, once bold and overconfident, had been humbled. Neighbors had witnessed the transformation and understood the lesson that patience and preparation often speak louder than anger or aggression. The man's calm, deliberate actions had not only defended his boundaries, but had also redefined the balance of power in the SE neighborhood. The night ended quietly, with a sense of peace that had been absent for weeks. The man knew that he had not only protected himself, but had also demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and strategic action. The group had been shocked, the neighborhood had been impressed, and his authority had been firmly established. The story, however, was not yet complete. The final part would reveal the lasting consequences in the ultimate restoration of respect. The morning after the confrontation, the neighborhood felt different. There was a quiet respect in the air, a subtle acknowledgement that things had changed. People who had once watched from the sidelines now spoke with a sense of awareness. They recognized that the man's calm, patient, and deliberate actions had not only protected his boundaries, but it also restored a sense of order and respect to the community. He stepped outside as usual, taking a slow walk around his property. The group that had once tested him was noticeably subdued. They lingered at a distance, whispering among themselves, their usual confidence replaced by a cautious wariness. Their previous attempts to provoke, intimidate, or embarrass him had failed, and they now understood that their assumptions had been entirely wrong. As he moved through the neighborhood, neighbors greeted him warmly, some even stopping to offer small words of admiration. They spoke quietly, almost reverently, about how he had handled the situation. They were impressed not by loud confrontations or displays of anger, but by the calm, steady, and deliberate manner in which he had asserted his authority. The respect he had earned was genuine and enduring, the kind that arises not from fear, but from clear demonstration of knowledge, preparation, and integrity. The group that had caused so much trouble tried to maintain appearances, walking past with forced smiles, trying to appear unaffected, yet it was obvious that they were humbled. Every glance they cast in his direction carried hesitation, uncertainty, and an unspoken acknowledgement of their misjudgment. They had learned a lesson that words could not fully convey. Patience, calmness, and careful preparation are more powerful than arrogance, noise, or impulsive aggression. He continued documenting the situation, not because he wanted to punish them, but because he knew the value of evidence and clarity. His careful record-keeping ensured that if any further provocations occurred, he would be prepared. It was not about retaliation. It was about maintaining order and ensuring that respect and boundaries were understood and upheld. Neighbors began to share their observations with one another, quietly discussing how the events had unfolded. Many had witnessed the provocations firsthand and saw the man's calm response. Others had only heard whispers, but now, seeing the result, they recognized the wisdom in his approach. The man had demonstrated that authority is not demanded by raising one's voice, but earned through consistent, measured, and thoughtful action. The group that had once challenged him slowly began to realize the implications of their misjudgment. They had assumed that silence was weakness, that patience was hesitation, and that a calm demeanor was ignorance. They had been wrong. The man's authority had been revealed not through confrontation, but through strategy, evidence, and clarity. They now understood that they had underestimated someone who had been quietly preparing, observing, and documenting every action. In the days that followed, the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy, but the shift in dynamics remained. The man's authority was recognized and respected. The group no longer attempted provocations, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding. They recognized that boundaries were no longer to be tested, that the man's calm strength was not to be underestimated. The man himself continued his routines, quietly maintaining his property, interacting with neighbors politely, and observing carefully. He did not flaunt his victory or boast about his authority. His approach remained consistent, calm, deliberate, and measured. Yet the respect he had earned was unmistakable. People acknowledged his presence, not with fear, but with genuine regard for his patience, clarity, and quiet strength. One afternoon, he noticed that the group had begun to speak differently among themselves. Their conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, and respectful. They had learned that arrogance and provocation were ineffective against someone who had patience, preparation, and authority. The lesson was profound, and it extended beyond the immediate neighborhood. It was a reminder that assumptions about others can be dangerously misleading, and that true strength often lies in calmness, awareness, and strategic action. The man also reflected on the impact this experience had on him personally. He realized that patience and careful observation are powerful tools. By remaining calm, documenting events, and preparing for the right moment, he had turned what could have been a chaotic and stressful situation into an opportunity to demonstrate integrity and authority. He had protected his boundaries, earned respect, and changed the dynamic of the neighborhood without resorting to anger or force. Neighbors began to approach him more openly, sharing their own experiences and concerns. They sought advice, guidance, and support, recognizing that his approach had value not just in this situation but in life more broadly. His calm demeanor, careful preparation, strategic thinking became a quiet example of how challenges can be met effectively and respectfully. The group, now fully aware of their misjudgment, began to show subtle signs of change. They no longer attempted to provoke him or others. Their behavior shifted toward cautious respect, understanding that actions have consequences and that underestimating someone can lead to unexpected outcomes. They had been humbled, not through confrontation or anger, but through the quiet, deliberate demonstration of authority and preparation, over time, the neighborhood itself began to adopt a more respectful atmosphere. People became more aware of boundaries, more thoughtful in their interactions, and more attentive to the dynamics around them. The man's calm authority had created a ripple effect, subtly influencing the community and encouraging others to act with consideration and awareness. The man continued his routines, aware that vigilance was important, but also confident that the lessons had been learned. The group that had once caused disruption was no longer a threat, having internalized the reality of his authority. The neighborhood had shifted toward a balance of respect, awareness, and understanding. He often reflected on the journey, recognizing the importance of patience, observation, and careful action. The provocations that had once seemed challenging had been opportunities to demonstrate quiet strength and strategic thinking. Through calm, deliberate responses, he had transformed the situation entirely. Earning respect and restoring order, neighbors continued to speak of the events. Quietly acknowledging the man's approach, they admired the way he had handled the situation, not with anger or confrontation, but with calm, strategic action. His actions had created a sense of stability and respect, demonstrating that authority is most powerful when exercised with thoughtfulness and integrity. The group that had once tried to provoke him became a subtle example for others in the neighborhood. Their misjudgment, humility, and eventual recognition of his authority served as a reminder that arrogance and assumptions are dangerous when faced with patience, preparation, and calm strength. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. The man's authority was established, respected, and acknowledged quietly. He continued to interact politely with neighbors, maintain his routines, and observe carefully, demonstrating that true strength lies in calm, deliberate action rather than force or aggression. The lasting impact of the events became evident in the small, everyday interactions of the neighborhood. People treated one another with more thoughtfulness. Boundaries were respected more consistently, and a sense of quiet order prevailed. The man's influence had been subtle but powerful, shaping behavior through example rather than confrontation. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on everything that had happened: the challenges, the provocations, the careful preparation, and the eventual revelation of his authority had taught valuable lessons. Patience, observation, and strategic action are often more effective than immediate reactions. Calm strength commands respect in ways that anger and force cannot.